Good afternoon. It's great to see you here. Many familiar faces, some new faces. It's absolutely wonderful to be able to welcome you to the launch of Timescales, Thinking Across Ecological Temporalities. As Zoom so handily tells you, my name is Bethany Wiggin, and I'm the faculty director of the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities and one of Timescales' 3 co-editors. It's my sincere pleasure to welcome you and to thank you for joining us to celebrate the creation of this bound paper object so long in the making. This object serves up chapters that model environmental inquiry across the environmental arts and sciences. It documents the development of environmental research experiments by artists, academics, and with public audiences. And it gathers together countless collaborative conversations, or as the volume calls them, chit-chats, in the pages of a truly beautiful object that the University of Minnesota produced. As we begin, I want to acknowledge my location and the University of Pennsylvania's location in the traditional homeland of the Lenni-Lenape people. While English Quaker colonist William Penn sought to maintain friendly and fair relations with Lenape neighbors, his colonial successors did not. I want to point out the foundation of the University of Pennsylvania and the program of its first provost as particularly pernicious to the fortunes and futures of Indigenous neighbors at the time of our institution's founding amidst the French and Indian War in the 18th century. This afternoon, I'm here primarily in the role of MC, but first I'd like to offer some thank yous and then some reflections on timescales. But let me begin by sharing this afternoon's 75-minute program with you. So soon we'll hear from the volume's other editors, Carolyn Fornoff and Patricia Yoonji Kim, and they will be followed by volume contributor Waichi Dimok, and then Mary Mattingly and Yamanja Brown. Schedules and Zoom life being what they are, Mary has to leave us shortly, but we will be momentarily joined by Stephanie Lemonager to offer a comment on timescales after Yamanja's remarks and rounding out the more formal part of this program. In the last half an hour or 20 minutes together, we've reserved for your comments and your questions. And if you're a book contributor, of course, we really want to hear from you. And we hope all of you will lend your voice to this chorus. We really look forward to a lively discussion. And just to note, to ask a question or offer a comment, you can simply indicate in the chat that you have a question, or you can use the raise hand function, and I will simply call on you in the order that I see you. And you can unmute yourself and then pose your question. So before I share a brief reflection on timescales and the modes of transdisciplinary inquiry it models, I do need to say some thank yous, and what a pleasure. Timescales has 21 authors. Thank you especially to you. And thank you also to the research foundations at the universities of Illinois and Pennsylvania who provided publication support. Thank you to the University of Minnesota Press, really, in my opinion, the premier imprint for publications in the environmental humanities. I was eager to place the book there and delighted by our editor, Doug Armado's interest in it after Carolyn and I pitched it to him in a whirlwind at the conference of the Modern Languages Association when it was here in Philadelphia. Doug subsequently spent time with me over a very long breakfast in Minneapolis to learn more about PPEH and to develop a plan to support this ambitious volume. Thanks also to Doug for his willingness to defend the book from one critic who allegedly sniped that the sprawling collaborative endeavors the book draws on would be possible only at elite institutions. At the press, we'd also like to thank Maggie Sattler, who produced 3 podcast episodes that accompany the volume and which are available at the press's website, and who also helped with the press's co-sponsorship of today's event. Thanks also to the co-sponsors, departments, and programs at Penn, from which some of the volume's authors hail or were trained as graduate students and have now gone on to become doctors and professors. Thanks too to Pig Iron Theatre Company, whose embodied research and method of devised performance has offered a powerful and provocative interlocutor about research creation. I'm enormously grateful to our staff at PPEH, Mia Devanza and Angela Ferranda, who planned today's event from start to finish. And last but not least, I want to salute my extraordinary co-editors and co-authors, Carolyn Fornoff and Patricia Yunji Kim. It's been a real pleasure to chit chat with you, and amidst the celebrations of our work together, I have to admit to just a note of sadness as this collaboration draws to a close. Now let me offer a few remarks about environmental humanities, academic cultures, and the educational challenges presented by the global ecological crisis, including climate change. PPEH, as you perhaps know, is an unusual academic program founded by students in a class I taught on sustainability and utopianism now 8 years ago. At that time, it was the only class at Penn cross-listed between humanities departments and the social and natural sciences. We read widely in sustainability science and sustainability humanities. We worked historically, exploring the twine of literary and scientific aspirations in early issues of the journal Nature, for example, and analyzed ecologist Rachel Carson's literary techniques. We explored green utopian experiments, both fictional and lived. And at the end of that semester, we mounted a climate fiction festival inspired by Stephanie Lemonager's path-breaking work with students. Since then, and in collaboration with students and program fellows, I've developed teaching habits and techniques that inform what I've come to think of as a pedagogy of the climate changed. It's a topic I've had the huge pleasure of writing about in a forthcoming article with former teaching assistants and PPEH fellows, Martin Promoli and Luna Sarti. And it's a pedagogy that's been very much co-developed by many PPEH students. In the program, we take the challenges of the Anthropocene quite seriously, including the fact that humans have made and now inhabit a fundamentally different planet than that which existed in the Holocene. A period of relative climate stability has been superseded by anthropogenically driven instability. In our projects and curriculum at PPEH, we attend to how we, unequally and often unjustly, have made and remade Holocene worlds, reducing its diverse lifeways and habitats. While universities have been practicing interdisciplinarity for decades, the two cultures, the sciences and the humanities, continue to loom, especially high in graduate education. These twin towers originate in the 19th century, born of the separation between man and nature, and they remain one of the academic landscape's most dominant features. Their prominence monumentalizes the sad truth that we continue to educate our students for a world that no longer exists. What we need is research and teaching for the climate changed. The knowledges and forms of expertise we need in climate changing worlds will not resemble those produced in fields inherited from the 19th century, whether that field is bench biology or literary criticism. Today's most innovative environmental research is following new paths along routes that weave in and out of the university, locating expertise in diverse communities and co-creating research questions and agendas that also foster public engagement. As PPEH has grown out of that old class on sustainability and utopianism, we have endeavored to nurture a place-based community of practice that centers environmental justice and feminist practices of care, especially for forgotten and unloved places, extractive landscapes, and dumps. Our collaborative research projects locate expertise amidst the ruins, explicitly challenging the assumption that BIPOC and/or global South communities can't afford to be interested in sustainability. As PPEH fellow Shamina Ogbemi told Pennsylvania Commonwealth legislators and their aides earlier this spring, the legislators' assumption that Black and Brown residents needed convincing to act on climate flies in the face of national polling data showing that communities of color are far more likely than white communities to welcome climate action at the national and the local levels. Recognizing the chauvinism more or less explicit in developmentalist models, current fellow Santiago Cunal has this spring initiated a listening project in the most populous poor neighborhood in Buenos Aires, Villa 31, to explore neighbors' views and desires for clean electricity and to possibly challenge policy assumptions that green energy is not a priority for residents. To this date, Timescales is the most conventional academic research outcome that PPEH has made. And while this book has 21 individual authors, it is in a real sense also the product of a community of practice, one engaged in designing and conducting experiments in research and pedagogy of the climate changed. Many of our collaborative communities' research expressions are less easily bound between a book's cover, but please do stay tuned for the forthcoming special issue, Rising Waters, Philadelphia and Mumbai, which includes among its 6 articles one by PPEH fellow Tatagat Bhatia. While we aim to address academic audiences, we also aim to make research that circulates in and with the community who made it. These projects aim to instantiate what I think is the true potential of the environmental humanities. In the words of Deborah Bird Rose, that's the productive fiction between critique and action. And here's just a few of my favorite PPH examples. These will be familiar to some of you. Ecotopian toolkits, or living archives of endangered federal environmental data. We've made a 12-part podcast, Data Remediations. We've co-created oral history collections and devised community-led tours of Philadelphia petro landscapes and petro legacies. We've offered Futures Beyond Refining workshops for 8th graders. This year alone, we've provided over 20 workshops on climate storytelling for students as young as 6th grade and as old as university professors. That is ancient. And we've made some documentary films on topics, including learning with water. And next month, we'll film climate storytellers on location for 2 days for a documentary companion to our climate storytelling workshops and curriculum workbook for use in both formal and informal environmental education settings. I hope you get a sense of the restless and rigorous experiments we make at PPEH in the pages of Timescales. And I'd like to turn it over now to co-authors and tireless experimenters Carolyn Fornoff and Patricia Yunji Kim, who will offer their reflections on the volume's pessimistic chit-chats, on its speaking halal carts, sinking wetland boats, and in the words of our introductory essay, so many often unremarked practices of maintenance. Over to you, Carolyn.
Great, thank you so much, Bethany, for that warm welcome. And it's just such a delight to be here celebrating with the many co-authors of this book, as well as the public, the exciting culmination of this project that is many years in the making. I want to just mention before I begin that I'm speaking to you from central Illinois, which are the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Wea, Miami, Sauk, Kickapoo, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these Native nations and prior to their forced removal. And because of that, as a land grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands and to acknowledge their histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution over the last 2 centuries. And so today, when I was thinking about this talk and how I was going to briefly introduce the idea of timescales, I was thinking about that land acknowledgement statement and the way in which it brings to the fore what Marxist philosopher Ernst Bloch, who Bethany cites in the introduction, called the simultaneity of the non-simultaneous. And when Bloch wrote this in Germany in 1935, he used this phrase, the simultaneity of the non-simultaneous, to challenge reactionary ideas about ethnic nationalism promoted by Nazi Germany, and to argue that the present is not uniformly experienced by all peoples, but that the past continues to contest any singular configuration of the now. So we can think about this, thinking about it here from Illinois, about how the forced removal of Native peoples removed knowledge about the land, how the transformation of prairie swampland into cultivable farmland has also changed both the present and the future, making this region more vulnerable to flooding. And of course, these examples spool out in multiple directions. We open the introduction talking about how the greatest source of ice in Antarctica, the Totten Glacier, was detached from the bedrock in 2016. And the way in which sort of this brings into high relief this collision of temporalities, of deep time, of this ice shelf that was formed millions of years ago, the present in which this ice shelf is rapidly melting, and the future in which rising waters will disproportionately affect island nations and island peoples, as well as coastland communities. I'm a Latin Americanist, and of course, this all connects to colonialism and extractive capitalism, and the way in which those forces have shaped both the past, present, and future in Latin America. And so when we, as a collective of fellows in 2016, were thinking about what topic we wanted to organize our academic conference around, we all thought about this idea of time as being one of the central issues that environmental crisis calls us to think about and to think about together. The timescales of environmental crisis seem too unwieldy to tackle from any singular disciplinary position. And so we decided as a cohort that it would be fantastic to bring together a group of people representing different disciplines to think about these issues. And so before I turn the word over to Patricia Kim, I'll read just a quick paragraph from the introduction where we define what we mean by timescales. Our choice of the word timescales to organize the constellation of work gathered in this book registers our desire to foreground the deep time of non-human processes. By insisting on a plurality of scales and on their overlaps and entanglements, we want to push back against the discrete, measurable time period. Time cannot be measured in so many coffee spoons. Timescales rejects man as the measure of all things. Unlike a time frame in which a period of time is neatly bracketed from what came before and what will follow, a timescale implies depth. We envision a timescale not as a smooth slice of neatly separated layers of time, but rather as composed of jostling and unstable temporalities, defined by processes of assembling and unraveling, ruptures and contingency. Thinking through timescales can also illuminate alternative viewsheds and suggest historical observations at a variety of resolutions and perspectives. Timescales understand temporality as a simultaneously material and discursive premise with its own weight or mass, modeled in ways that disclose certain kinds of information while diminishing other perspectives. And so this book brings together a variety of scholars who are thinking about time from radically different perspectives, from the perspective of the difficulty of pinning down the deep geological past, to thinking about the accelerating temporality of melting ice. And so with that, I will turn it over to my co-editor, Patricia Yunji Kim.
Thank you, Carolyn. First, I want to thank Angela and Mia for organizing this event, and also to my co-editors, Bethany and Carolyn. I'm really grateful for having been able to work with both of you in this way and also in other ways. I am calling from New York City, and I would also like to acknowledge the unceded ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape community, their elders past and present, as well as their future generations. Now, as Carolyn mentioned, we really wanted to foster kind of interdisciplinary thinking around this topic of ecological time. And we really wanted to include the arts and artists as important interlocutors. And we did this, actually, let me share my screen really quickly, excuse me, so you can see something. Okay. All right. So we did this by inviting artists to contribute to these conversations, both at our conference, but within the volume, within this present volume. These artist contributions function as experimental interludes, or we call them etudes, that punctuate the text of scholarly essays. Of course, these etudes offer new ways of thinking about environmental time, so there's epistemological value. But one of the most exciting aspects of their work is that they offer a sense of the kinds of worlds that are possible, what these worlds might look like, and how it might feel to live in them. All three of our etudes embrace speculative inquiry, open-endedness, and experiments that might lead nowhere, while always emphasizing the importance of fostering an intergenerational collaborative ethics of care. And I'll share just a few brief words about these etudes. First, we have Period of Animate Existence, which was or is a hybrid experimental symphonic theater piece that premiered in Philadelphia in September 2017. It's a collaboration between Pig Iron Theater's director Dan Rothenberg, composer Troy Harion, and designer Mimi Lien. The play featured conversations and encounters between elders, children, and machines, all played by a volunteer group of choristers ages 7 to 81. It consists of 5 staged movements, all of which are unrelated, but nevertheless complement each other in terms of tone, mood, and tempo in order to produce a cohesive experience that invited the audience to contemplate our planetary futures. Next, Wetland was a floating experiment in sustainable living that was docked at Bartram's Garden along the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia, envisioned and designed by the brilliant Mary Mattingly, a New York-based artist who works across different media to think about life with climate change. Wetland was a partially submerged building that integrates water, land, and the built environment to explore the urgency in developing social systems of mutual care. Mattingly has compellingly described Wetland as, quote, a form of performance art, an exploration through endurance, an act of creating an ecosystem from which people will eat, drink, shower, work, sleep, learn, and share. The experimental lab opened in 2016, and I, as a former PPH fellow, had the great opportunity and privilege to sort of like draft or sail in a kayak to the boat and help set it up. It was great fun. But anyway, Wetland moved up and down the tidal Schuylkill River, but in June 2017, Wetland sank due to unusual torrential rains and debris. Finally, we invited Los Angeles-based Salvadoran artist Beatrice Cortez to contribute an essay and examples of her sculptural work, including cairn and memory insertion capsule. Cortez's work reflects on temporal simultaneities, that is, how pasts, including deep historical and recent pasts, inform our possible futures. Moreover, Cortez's understanding of ecology and time does not essentialize or gloss over differences along lines of race, nationality, borders, class. As she writes, quote, we always imagine Indigenous people being part of our past, and I want to imagine them as part of our future. So on the one hand, this artist's work gestures towards variations of and on ecological time. But on the other hand, this artist, Beatrice Cortez, envisions the history of climate change and the Anthropocene as a history of migration, alienation, white supremacy, and colonialism. artistic thinking and labor have deeply impacted the shape of this book's explorations of ecological time. And as I hope you'll read, these artists and their projects function as important critiques of the systems of power that fuel what we might call the white patriarchal capitalocene. Moreover, the artists offer models of the kinds of futures that are possible if only we, the academy, the institution, or the global north, make a deep commitment to slow down and hold ourselves accountable to each other. And in addition to hopefully picking up a copy of our book, you're also able to search and learn more about each of these artists and their incredible works and projects online. And we're going to hear from Mary Mattingly in just a bit. So turning it back over to you, Bethany, I think.
Great. Thank you so much to Carolyn and Patricia. It's now over to Wai-Chi and then to Mary.
Hi, I'm just so honored and thrilled to be here. And I want to thank Bethany and Carolyn and Patricia for organizing the conference in the first place, and to Angela for helping with everything, for this particular Zoom meeting. In the volume, I my piece ended with Indigenous peoples and the resilience of people who were fighting against Line 3, which is this new pipeline that is still being built, and they're preparing for it already. And what I thought I'll do today is to talk about an extension of that, and imagine what that would be like, to imagine that resilience being projected into the 21st century. So I'm going to talk about for about 5 minutes about a long history of pandemics and how Indigenous communities respond to COVID-19. But in order to talk about, think about the different time scales that come into play in this history, I would like to talk about 2 other points in time. So what I'll do is I will start from, from the 18th century, to think about the ecosystem of epidemics, in that case, smallpox, and what else was in play at that point. So it was during the French and Indian War, which was against the British and the French. And the Cherokees were initially allies of the British, but when 30 Cherokee warriors were murdered, they decided to go against the British. And so there was the Anglo-Cherokee War. And at the same time, as you can see from those days, that was intersecting with the smallpox outbreaks in the US in the Southeast. So we now get this infamous communication between Lord Jeffrey Amherst, who was the commander-in-chief of the British forces in North America, writing to Colonel Henry Bouquet, would it not be contrived to send the smallpox among those disaffected tribes of Indians? It was very open, it was undisguised. Just
It seems, have we lost Wai-Chi? I think that we might have done. We will.
I think she just got back.
Oh, she's back in. Wonderful.
You're muted, Wai-Chi.
Wai Chi, we hear you now. You're good.
Okay. Can you also see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so when Lord William Amherst was sending this communication, it turned out that a few weeks before that, somebody else who was actually being besieged inside Fort Pitt was already had already done what Lord Amherst was suggesting that it should be done. Was that we gave them 2 blankets and a handkerchief out of the smallpox hospital. I hope it will have the desired effect. So the 18th century gives us an ecosystem in which there was undisguised acknowledgement of the efficacy of using biological warfare, and also the sense that maybe Native Americans were on the receiving end. But as historian, why is it that I can't seem to get it to go to the next slide?
Sometimes if you just hit the forward arrow button once or twice, that might do
Okay.
it.
Sorry, I'm having so much technical difficulty. What's okay?
No problem. I would suggest that you come out of presentation
Okay.
mode and just leave it in.
Should I try one more time? Maybe I should just show the whole thing.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, instead of doing, okay. It's so the sense that we've been getting is that the Cherokees were on the receiving end of biological warfare. But as a historian, Paul Kelton argued in his book, Cherokee Medicine, Colonial Germs, it's very important to think about what the Cherokees were actually doing before they were being, whatever they were doing was being upended by colonial warfare. And he made the argument that actually the Cherokees had very important public health innovations that warfare completely upended. So he wants to get us to think about what that might have been like if the war had not been there, if the public health measures had just been allowed to go forward. And it turns out that we really need to go forward to the 19th century to see what that might look like. I mean, it wasn't possible in the 18th century, but in the 19th century, when the smallpox vaccine was becoming available, we have this astonishing observation from Edward Jenner, who was the one who developed the smallpox vaccine in 1802. I am much gratified at the good sense manifested by the Cherokee Indians. Who would have thought that vaccination would already have found its way into the wilds of America? So they were in fact ahead of everybody else in adopting the vaccine. And that is not something that one would have been able to predict just staying within the 18th century. So now I want to fast forward to the 20th century, 21st century, and to a PBS feature is on NewsHour. And it was November 24th, 2020, how the Cherokee Nation has curtailed the pandemic. What PBS was talking about was the cutting-edge contact tracing that was being implemented by the Cherokee Nation. This was followed by another innovation when the Cherokees received the Pfizer vaccine in December, and they decided that they would put the Cherokee speakers at the head of the line. They were the first to get the vaccine. And that would be one way, to save the language speakers and save the language and endanger the language. And it would be a way to signal to everyone else that it was safe to take the vaccine because the most cherished members of the community were getting the vaccine first. And we see the result of that. This is the Cherokee vaccine rollout. On February 8th, all the Cherokee speakers, elders, and health workers had all gotten both shots. It's a 12% vaccination rate. By February 21st, the vaccine was open to those 16 and older. By March 11th, they extended the vaccine to everyone, non-natives as well as native. So this is the Indigenous public health strategy that was actually implemented when there was nothing standing in this way. And I want to go back to Calton's point as well earlier, that we shouldn't just focus on one tribe because that could be misleading. And we might think that maybe the Cherokees were just outliers. So I want to point to another NPR feature that is around the same time that the Cherokee vaccine was open to those 16 and older. And it is an extensive analysis of a lot of Native communities, and it says why Native Americans are getting the COVID-19 vaccine faster. So that was just kind of a general account. And now I'll go to the final portion of my talk, partly just to give you the context, how astonishing that is. The pre-existing conditions on reservations are these. Native households 19 times more likely to let indoor plumbing, washing hands, very, very difficult. Native Americans 600 times more likely to die of TB, 200 times more likely to die of diabetes. So this was what Native communities started out with. And the Navajo Nation has always been singled out as the one in which has been always in need of, in imminent danger of a public health crisis. And we were beginning to see that. We saw that at the beginning of the pandemic, May 18, 2020. The Navajo Nation surpassed New York State with the highest infection rate in the US. And then November 20th, the infection rate was 37.8. I mean, it was unheard of in the world. It was simply the highest infection rate in the world. But let's not forget what Kyle Powers White reminds us, that Indigenous people had always been very close to the edge and they had always come back. So this is a great essay, Critical Investigations of Resilience, a brief introduction to Indigenous environmental studies and science. I really want to emphasize the science because I think that is especially important at this moment to emphasize that in fact the science intervention of Indigenous communities is really non-trivial right now. So let's look at, this is Navajo Medical Center, and this is what the chief medical officer at that medical center said, that it's not just Western medicine that is being practiced there. It's actually a combination of Indigenous medicine and Western medicine. My grandmother told me listening is medicine. And what you say, what comes out of your mouth is medicine. Probably stronger than what you give as medication. When you only treat patients physically, you just throw medications at them. But the Navajo way, we treat them physically, mentally, spiritually. You see the result of that. This is just a few days ago, Forbes magazine. The Navajo Nation is beating out every state's coronavirus vaccine. It is not the Cherokees of the Navajo Nation. So I think I'll stop right there, but I think they get the point that, you know, we need different timescales to think about ecosystems, and the Indigenous ecosystems, especially time dependent. How it looks like has everything to do with what kind of time scale that we adopt. Thank you.
Thank you so much, YT, for those really illuminating and provocative remarks to think through also connections between environmental and medical humanities, Indigenous science, or as Kyle Powis-White also sometimes calls it, Indigenous science fictions, which I think is very akin to some of the speculative projects that we heard Patricia talking about earlier. I'm so glad now to be able to turn it over to one of those artists who Patricia talked about, and Mary will now talk herself. Mary, it's a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much. I believe I might be having some audio issues, and if so, please let me know. But just by way of introduction, I wanted to say that I see this work as co-building living systems with humans and non-humans, and often they're follies that float or stagnate, grow, or are pulled. I see them as experiential, as durational, and as alive, and think that sculpture in general can change perspectives, and it can change perceptions, and especially I think when it's situated in public space, which brings with it issues like maintenance, of course, compromise, and potentials for co-building more regenerative futures together. I was raised in an agricultural town where the drinking water was polluted from pesticides like DDT, and water was a continual concern. So I began building wearable sculptures that really tried to actualize those concerns about access to basic needs. And I constructed suits that became tents at night with flexible solar cells and water purification systems made from found scraps embedded in long sleeves, to try to share this increasingly precarious future, which I depicted as one where residents in nature had been extracted from and people navigated less hospitable lands. In 2006, my focus shifted to New York's harbor, really out of necessity. I thought if life was art and I needed to combine them, a self-sufficient floating island would allow me to live in a way that met my ethics and economic reality. And after 3 years of bureaucratic navigation and compromise, working with school children and officials and friends and strangers, WaterPod was built almost entirely from the waste chain in a barter economy. On that project, scientists worked with engineers to build systems where food, power, and water could be produced on board. And living on board, I participated in a zero waste ecosystem that was then sort of interrogated and crowdsourced by visitors with different experience sets, and finally became robust enough to meet our needs. And in the beginning, of course, it wasn't. And I think projects like this could find their power from really being improvisational and tying science to multiple visions. For me, WaterPod was an introduction to New York City waterways that led me and collaborators to a project called Swale, in a city where 1 in 3 people lives in what's considered a food desert. Swale was built on a reused barge, and it's a floating food forest that points to forms of extraction, but also regeneration. And I see Swale as really being about growing or picking food on public land in New York City, a situation that's been illegal for almost a century, where a project can be maybe situate itself as a more provocative public artwork that can use the common laws of the water, in this case, as a loophole, to be a platform where anyone can pick fresh foods for free because, well, some residents have access to what's currently about 100 acres of community garden space in New York. The city manages 30,000 acres of public parkland that could potentially have a different or an additional use. Swale followed traditional ecological knowledge and insights of Eleanor Ostrom, who claimed that in a vibrant commons, people had a vital role to play, not only as beneficiaries, but as co-creators and protectors and decision makers. As a direct result of Swale, with the support of community groups, in 2017, the Parks Department of New York City did open their first public foodway at Concrete Plant Park in the Bronx. And I say all this as sort of like to say that these projects are collaborative and build upon each other, and each influences the other. And projects like Swale really built off of experimental forestry, like Arctic Food Forest, which was a public art project that looked at global warming and food futures in Alaska in 2015. It was a strategy to vision potential edible landscape in a climate that's quickly warming and feeling the extent of climate change, much faster than many places. This project was based on geologic records in Alaska, so built with scrap from the area with Alaskan soils and looking at perennial fruits and foods that are currently growing in agricultural zones 5 and 6, and bringing them to Anchorage and north. And this project really came out of being able to in 2014 be involved in conversations called the Week of the Arctic, where heads of native corporations were visited by Shell Oil, by the Obama administration, and artists and arts organizations were able to be listeners and hear about futures of food in Alaska. So this came out of that, and looking at the Eocene epoch and looking at what was growing 55 million years ago in Alaska, and looking at the Pliocene and what was growing then, and what's expected to thrive in a warming Arctic alongside of climate change. In a similar mode of looking backwards in order to look forwards, this is from the fossil record found in Gilboa, New York, where artists and scientists together reconstructed this early design of this early botanical system here. So this is the Gilboa site, which is covered by the Gilboa Dam now, but is really also known for these fossilized tree stumps that have revealed the Earth's oldest known forest to date, it seems. So these petrified stumps were discovered in the early 1920s when they began excavating this dam. And this was the result, I think, along the lines of displacement involved bringing tropical fruit trees, coconut palm, Perotis palm, and a ponytail palm from agricultural zones 9 and 10 to upstate New York, zones 4 and 5 currently, for what could be considered an uncanny living sculpture that actually would be able to survive in 15 years' time and is predicted to be able to thrive in the next 40 years. So both Arctic food forest and along the lines of displacement involved taking a cue from assisted plant migration programs that the US Forest Service is embarking on to plan for a near future when trees can't acclimate fast enough. So these living sculptures, which are complicated by their process, and in the case of along the lines of displacement, it involved shipping nursery trees long distances to ask people to imagine place-based futures. It speaks to a messy complicity. It speaks to a futility, a hope, and a potential regeneration. Also techno fixes and deep time imaginaries coupled with future imaginaries and potentialities. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you so much. Those palm trees have long haunted my imagination. I'm so glad that you showed them to us. And it's a real pleasure to welcome Yamanja Brown, who wrote for the book Dirt Eating in the Anthropocene. And over to you, Yamanja.
Great, thank you. And thank you to all the editors for all their work on this book and on this event. So because I was allotted 5 minutes to share, I started thinking about the container of 5 minutes and what it is. And of course, in some ways it's inconsequential, but it also contains these vast timescales, right? So among the many, many things that it contains are all of the economic, racial, and social dynamics that bring those of us who are here to this place together. The minerals mined for our computers, the energy, most likely fracked gas for many of us, that make our computers hum. And there's also the futures of what we hope these ideas might do in the world, as well as the material life of the ideas in the data storage centers in the desert that will most likely become too hot to store our ideas pretty soon. So in thinking about all that, the big and the small timescales of this moment, I was thinking about, in general, I think the way that I conceive of a timescale is through the material that to which it adheres, right? And so I begin very locally, and then it quickly moves outward in kind of an overwhelming, expansive way. So my contribution to this volume is an essay about eating dirt. And just note that sometimes I'll say dirt and sometimes I'll say clay. And I do that for a reason. I conflate those things because I like all the connotations of dirt. I think they're important. So I began the essay with thinking about this particular moment of driving on I-95 through New Jersey, which many of you probably know, through the Elizabeth area, which is incredibly depressing for many reasons. And in the median of the highway, there was a construction site and there was this upturned pile of red dirt. And I had this moment of total desire, and which wasn't surprising. I had always wanted to eat red clay in particular, probably because I'm anemic. But for whatever reason, in that moment, I decided to kind of investigate in some kind of academic way what this pile of clay meant and what my desire for it meant. And as I did, many things began to enter. And I began looking at soil maps of New Jersey, trying to figure out what the dirt was, which brought me deep into geological time, thinking about the practice of eating dirt, which it turns out is incredibly common across time and place, opened up all kinds of social and material questions for me, as well as considerations of ecological and social futures. So I'm not going to list the ideas here because 5 minutes couldn't contain them. I tried, but that's kind of the point, is that there's a way in which I think the body is able to contain and collapse a thing that our language can't. And I wanted to ask why, like, what does it mean to invite and collapse those timescales and all of the things that dirt evokes within the body, and not give primacy to the mind or to language. So I began to think about the origins of the dirt that I looked at, which might have been shale bedrock that formed 200 million years ago, which is considered not very long ago, in northern New Jersey, and most likely would have been distributed to the surface by the last glacier that went through the area, which was the glacier that created New York City and Long Island. But it also might have been brick fill that was put there pretty recently to help build the highway or to fix it. Or it could have been from a chemical spill or paint or diesel oil, which by regulation must be dyed red. So there were many possibilities. And of course, I could have figured out a way to cross the scary highway and take a soil sample. But instead I speculated, and I think that even the act of taking a soil sample would have been perhaps a pretty similar act of speculation. So part of what I asked in this essay is, what does it mean to bring the possibilities and the indeterminacy of what might be shale, or clay formed from shale, or toxic industrial waste, as well as all the material and social histories that each of those contain, directly into the body, such that they can literally transform the one who is doing the eating. Yeah, I wanted to know if that act produced a particular kind of intimacy with the environment that might be important. And it got a little slippery because I am not telling people to eat dirt or to willingly ingest toxins, although we eat both of those things all the time. But wanted to think about dirt eating as method for getting close to information that dirt can impart, right? And kind of thinking about how that helps us perhaps relate differently to our surroundings, particularly if we begin with an urgency not only to be with, but be changed by our local terrain in the way that ingesting anything changes the organism that is doing the ingesting. So I'm going to kind of pivot to what I'm thinking about now, which is in part because I was thinking so much about shale and the implications of its clay and the desire for that clay. But also because I've been involved with a lot of organizing around shutting down fossil fuel infrastructure. And so tied to both those things, I've been doing shale rituals in various places, including where I grew up, which is deep shale country, but in New York, so it's protected from fracking. But I've been researching methane emissions at idle and retired gas and oil wells. And it really struck me when I learned at some point in the excitement of the beginning of one exciting thing about the pandemic was that emissions went down, and but also realizing that idle wells were actually emitting more methane than if they had been drilling. And so I started to really think about, like, what does this mean for the way that we think about time and the scale that we are operating on? Like, what are we asking for, and on what time scale are we asking for it? And if we begin to expand that ask, then if we begin to expand how we think, then how do our asks come to change? And so instead of thinking about the call to keep it in the ground, what does it look like to call instead for properly plugging wells, which happens to involve using shale clay that I so very much wanted to eat in New Jersey. So I think just to tie that all together, one of my final questions was just thinking about how the desire to bring clay into our own bodies might inform how we think about remediation of drilling sites, so that we may begin to cultivate possible futures on this planet that maybe outlast the timescales that we were previously thinking about. So I'll end there, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Yamanja, for that really lyrical set of reflections on eating the body and timescales. It's really always so rich to hear your work. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce our final speaker for the formal part of this program. Stephanie Lemonager has generously offered to provide a comment on the book. She is not one of the volume's contributors, although I feel her work's influence is palpable throughout. So over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Bethany, and thank you to everybody. Can everybody hear me? Excellent. Okay. So I'm going to do a kind of live action blurb here. And I want to say, first of all, thank you so much. I received this in the mail a while ago. It is a beautiful book. I'm very, very grateful to have it. I'm very, very grateful to be reading it. And I'm coming to you from the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya peoples, who still act as stewards of this land, who did not cede this land. I'm grateful to be here in the Pacific Northwest as a settler and a trespasser, but at least one who is attempting to reconcile myself to these histories of genocide in some way. I'm also between classes, so I'm going to have to leave you once I offer my live action blurb, and I'm sorry for that. I would love to be here with you longer, and thank you everybody who spoke. It was fascinating to hear about your work. So the co-authors of the introduction to Timescales tell us humbly that, quote, distant disciplinary collaboration can challenge unspoken assumptions grounding disciplinary cultures. It therefore requires time and trust. The going can be slow. Don't I know it? I know it well from my own work. And yet my experience of your work, you co-authors, is one of tremendous and remarkable agility, not to mention vivacity. I've been extremely impressed by the work of the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities throughout its life, which actually has been a fairly short institutional life, but so much has been done in that time. And in the face of material and ontological implosions that affect institutional functioning, not to mention planetary health, implosions including, of course, our ongoing global climate crisis, as well as COVID-19, which we could see as in some respects related to that climate crisis. And what I mean by the ontological insecurity that appears in the title of my very brief talk today derives from the work of my colleague at the University of Oregon, Kari Norgaard, a sociologist whose book Living in Denial contemplates climate change denial as an effect of the ways in which our climate crisis upends almost every assumption that modernity, as a foundational expression of colonialism, of racial capitalism, of ecological extractivism, has invested in the everyday. Without the modern assumption of climate, Mike Hume reminds us, we're fragile, enmeshed in the unpredictable atmospheric bodies of weather culturalists, he calls us. The breaking up of Euromodern white ontologies, of petromodernity, and of the temporalities that accompany all of that, enmeshed and entangled as it is, opens possibilities for what it means to speak with authority, for what it means to learn and to listen, for what education itself can and ought to become. The varied authors and artists in Timescales recognize not only the necessity in this epic of profound ecological transition of reconciling the temporalities of, and I'm quoting here, biological, material, and social networks, as you all say in your wonderful introduction, you also recognize the provincialism of heretofore institutionally empowered forms of time, including what we've known as history, or even the present. Likewise, the environmental humanities here is both an improvisational site for interdisciplinary and activist experiment, and also a placeholder, somewhat provincial in its actual language and its actual conceptualization even, a placeholder for placemaking to come within future academies, or maybe future institutions that aren't anything like the academies that we know. This is a volume about openings and opportunities that come in the wake of pain, of great pain and injury, openings of the university and its modes of disciplinary practice, for example, openings not always sought, but sometimes imposed. But where such looming sea change might call up the uncanny or horror, of course, always related to the uncanny, and embodied ideas like horror always accompany deep change, I would argue. Here, the authors remind us that what is felt as strange, even frightening, may also be, in the very long game of times, plural, a mode of care, a new mode of being together. A turn within the academy at large toward the serious study of thinking across temporalities. The ecological, the historical, the social, the extractive is both underway and yet long overdue. And I want to celebrate the release of this volume and the continuing research, performances, activisms, and embedded pedagogies that it indicates. Thank you for this work.
Thank you, Stephanie, for that really generous comment. Much appreciated. Thank you to all of the presenters who contributed such rich remarks. I can only imagine that there are questions and comments. As I mentioned in the introduction, we have other volume contributors who are here in the Zoom room, and of course, love to hear from you as well. I'm gonna just call on people who would like to contribute a comment or a question as I see your hand raised, or if you just indicate in the chat that you would like to contribute. Stephanie is departing for her graduate seminar, and I think that we have had to say goodbye also to Mary in our Zoom lives. I think we're attending probably 5 times as many things as we would in person. It's so wonderful to have many of you here. I see volume authors Dave Evans and Charles is here. So great to see you. Frank is here. I'm just kind of looking through. Jason, Omar is here. Kate Farquhar is here. If I haven't seen you and you're here, please holler at me. Would you like to offer a comment or perhaps present a few words on your chapter in the book? I see Dave Evans' hand. Dave, over to you. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Bethany, and congratulations. It's been a real pleasure to be participating in this volume, and I know how much work that you and the editors have done to make it come to fruition, so thank you so much. I also want to acknowledge my co-author from University of Pennsylvania, Jane Makowski, whom I don't see here on the call today. So I hope she forgives me if I speak on both of our behalf, but it was lovely to hear the podcast that she participated in before as well. I just want to, I'll open up with an acknowledgement of my own. I have to actually find here. It's that I am calling in from Yale University, and I acknowledge that the Indigenous peoples and nations where I currently am right now include the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Scaticoke, Golden Hill, Pagosset, Neantic, and Quinnipiac, and other Algonquian speaking peoples who have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. And I honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. And I also recognize the contributions of innumerable people of diverse backgrounds who laid the foundations of our economy and our personal privilege to be gathered here in peace and comfort today. And many of their names have been overlooked or forgotten, but their legacy echoes throughout our halls. And like one of the earlier speakers this evening, I say those acknowledgements in full recognition of what it means to think across timescales. And although I usually think in geological timescales, where in the chapter that Jane and I wrote, we describe all of geological time on the Earth as occupying a calendar year, and that even Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, walked across Eastern Africa just 6 hours before midnight on New Year's Eve to give a sense of how enormous geological time is. And we find ourselves catapulting into the Anthropocene. And it's really good for me as a scientist who usually just throws around millions of years to pause and think about what it means to cross timescales that really intersect with the human experience. So it's really nice for me to be here at this celebrated opening of the book, which I hope will lead to a lot of tremendous interactions in the future, open up lots of avenues of thought that cross disciplines, and to think about how the time scale that we occupy can really be a time that we engineer as humans forward to the future to think about, well, how would we like to engineer that future? So thank you so much for allowing me to participate and to reflect upon these numerous timescales all colliding together and all intersecting to create wonderful new avenues for further investigation.
Dave, thank you so much for your contributions with Jane to the volume and for those remarks. Stephanie, in her comment, said environmental humanities is kind of a placeholder for a university or an academy to come. And it's my great hope that it would be one in which collaborations and conversations between geophysicists and humanists would be less of a rarity and more of a commonplace. It's kudos to you for participating with us. It's been a real treat. Some of you may have seen that Naomi Miller from Penn Environment posed a question in the chat, and she has agreed to address that to the volume contributors as a whole. Over to you, Naomi.
Hi, so I'm an archaeologist and archaeobotanist, so I deal with a variety of timescales, but I usually stop at around 10 or 15,000 years. But the question was really more as in my capacity as a volunteer of the past few years of the organization Penn Environment. I think that one of the things I've learned is that they say the single most important thing you can do for the environment is vote. And that I think that just in my volunteer activities of petitioning, I've noticed in the past few years, there's been a real change in the, I talk to lots of people because trying to get their signatures on various petitions. And it's gotten easy, well, before the pandemic, it became easier and easier. And it's clear that there was, since 2017, there's been a change in consciousness, which I have practical experience with, and I think everybody here has observed. So I think that, the kind of work that I imagine is being done, I haven't read the book, obviously, but it sounds like, my familiarity with art projects that relate to the environment, which I usually find pretty inspiring and wonderful. I think that the more people understand, whether it's through science or through the humanities or through some combination of both, if it doesn't lead to political action, it's a problem. But if it does help political action, and that consciousness, I think, really precedes political action for an awful lot of people. That's all. So it's not really a question, just a comment.
Naomi, thank you so much for that question. And I'd like to give anyone who's a member, who contributed to the volume a chance to respond if you'd like. While you're thinking about your responses, Timescales authors, I'll just add, Naomi, that the PPEH's climate storytelling team has presented workshops to Penn Environment, to the Power Group. And in fact, we will be providing the keynote in Penn Environment's fall conference.
Oh, great.
And I elucidate that just to sort of signal to you, one of the ways that we're trying to work here is to produce volumes like Timescales, which are really intended. We would love to have a spillover audience, but it's really primarily an academic book.
Oh, yeah. That's what it sounds like.
We're really, also making work that engages with and is made with audiences and participants and co-researchers outside the academy, precisely because of this need for political action that you are also addressing. Would other volume contributors like to respond to Naomi's comment?
I'd like just to say a very short response. I think it's really important that, I'm not actually doing it a lot myself, but I think that it's really important for us to try to engage more in non-academic kinds of writing. I think that, it's not always easy for us to break out of our academic mode. But I think in order to talk, just to have that kind of spillover effect that Bethany was talking about, it's really pretty important for us to try to write in a different voice, and at least to have in mind a different kind of audience. I think that most of us, when we write, we're thinking of, people that we know, that we are very comfortable with. But it might actually be, might be good just exercise for us to try to imagine what it's like to write for Republican readers. Maybe we should try to get students to try to do that. Just to see what happens. Maybe they are Republicans, but in any case, I think it's just really good to try to write for the other side, or try to reach out to the other side.
Well, I don't know if you've read Overstory, but one of the nice things that he points out is that trees live, talking of timescales, which is relevant to the conference, and humanities. And he talks about trees live and they have experiences. It's just on a radically different timescale of humans. And I think that awareness of not being so anthropocentric and realizing that other forms of life live at different timescales is also kind of an interesting thought.
Yeah, I wrote a little piece about, I'm also an editor, so I write about what other people do, in my role as editor. So anyway, I was reporting on this game that was there was a first-year orientation game at the University of Chicago, and they got lots of people to. It was a massive game. I mean, with that over 1,000 people participating, and they have teams. There was one team that was from the medical school, and they had first-year medical students imagining what it's like to tell the story of the pandemic from this point of view of the virus. And that's a great way to think about it. You know, just get out of our own frame of reference and imagine. I mean, because it's their story as well as ours. So, you know, it should be the story as told by a micro.
That's so provocative, YT. I love that example. Omar has been trying to get in here too. I'd love to have you join in.
Well, thank you so much, Bethany. I just wanted to say very quickly that how much I enjoyed working with all of you, the editors, and I wanted to congratulate you for this really fantastic contribution, and sort of really finishing this project. I'm Umar Harmanshah. I'm an archaeologist, and I also appreciated Naomi's comment. Hi, Naomi. And as an archaeologist, I want to say that my memory of the Timescales event at Penn was just such a pleasure in terms of, like, we do academic work. Yes, this is an academic book, but that event and the book, I think the resulting book, is actually so poetic, in my opinion, that it illustrates this really powerful creativity and humanity of just really working on questions of climate change and deep time. Really surfaced, and that was just such a memorable event for me in terms of, like, the very interactions, you know, the time that we spent by the river, and, you know, the time that we spent discussing the racing extinction film. You know, those were just really super memorable for me. And after that, I was just so, I mean, environmental humanities at that time was very new to me, and so I was so inspired that I've been working with a number of colleagues at University of Illinois at Chicago, in collaboration with some colleagues at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and we ran a climate change related project funded by the Humanities Without Walls Foundation consortium, funded by a Mellon Foundation. And so that was about climate change, and it was about how different communities around the world have been sort of really experiencing climate change. But what we wanted to do is something very similar, in to bring sort of scientists and researchers with artists to work and collaborate with artists in the field. And we wanted to also see how fieldwork, a new idea of fieldwork that is collaborative, can actually just help us sort of really understand these questions in a really different way. So how do you do fieldwork to think about deep time? How do you do fieldwork to think about resilience of local communities in relation to what's happening with in their own environment? So that was just really, but all of that work was just so much inspired by my collaboration with in this book. And one sort of really quick comment in response to what Naomi was suggesting, in the concept of activism in my chapter. I kind of really modestly argued that one of the ways that we could actually practice political ecology, practice this kind of activism, is fieldwork. And that fieldwork, as an archaeologist, I'm very passionate about fieldwork, and that fieldwork can be very politically engaged. And that can actually, if we are willing to collaborate with local communities in pushing their interests with our academic sort of the powers that we have as academics, I think that has tremendous impact. And so I do my fieldwork in Turkey, where there are a lot of these crazy infrastructure projects that are sort of unsustainable, like a coal-fired power plant. And so as a project, we've been collaborating with the local community to fight a coal-fired power plant, and we had some enormous successes in the field. So I just wanted to say that activism doesn't have to be just in writing. It can be done in the field as well. But I wanted to just say, thank you so much for including me in this volume, and it's been such a pleasure working with you and getting to know all of you. And also a special sort of hello to Patricia, and it's been really great in these communications and conversations with her as well. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Umar. The pleasure and privilege has really been ours. It was so fun to have your essay. It's really fantastic. I'd like to hear, Charles, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I won't take too long. I've taught for 4 hours on Zoom and had 3 Zoom meetings. My brain is totally fried. I don't have anything profound to say, but wanted to show up for the book party and ran and poured myself a little celebratory drink to cheers all of you, and to congratulate Bethany and Patricia and Carolyn on the publication of the book, but also on the most amazing conference that Omer praised. For me, it was also one of the most amazing conferences I'd ever been to. I loved the collegiality across disciplines. I loved being around artists and scientists. That field trip down to the water was an amazing experience. And I'm really grateful that I had the chance to meet you all and be a part of this project. And looking forward to Timescales 2. Whenever you want to hold it, I will be there. And again, congratulations and thanks. Best wishes from Seattle.
Charles, that's remarkably generous of you. And I think it was a great conference. Carolyn and Patricia and the PPH fellows worked so assiduously on it and so creatively. I have had a couple of people say to me after some of our conferences, including Timescales, of, you guys plan the best conferences, we'll come anytime. And we have been a little taking a little break. They're a lot of work to organize. They're really, really special though. And that opportunity to see each other in person and to be together in a place, I think also maybe gets at a little bit about the potential of the political power or potential of fieldwork too. We work in community and with community also for that reason, a different type of fieldwork, but to be sure. We have exceeded our time. You've all been so gracious to stay with us for 10 minutes over. Before we close, I just really want to again thank my co-editors, Patricia and Carolyn, and again, thank all of you for being here, and especially to offer thanks to Mia Devanza and Angela Ferranda for their unwavering support and excellent counsel in planning this event. Thanks to you all. Congratulations to us all on the book. It's wonderful to have it in the world. Be well and be in touch.